It was the 1960s. Kennedy was in office. The first Bond movie, Dr. No, premiered. Star Trek changed the face of American television and what we aspire to be. Bands like Led Zeppelin and Beatles led the way, and disco was still years away. Okay, maybe months away. And Seiko introduced Japan's first ever automatic day-date watch, the Series 5. This is the Seiko 5 model number 51266010. I'm excited to share something different today. I thought we'd look back into the past. This Seiko was manufactured in 1969 and was a JDM, meaning it was meant for the Japanese domestic market. Today, Seiko 5s are thought of as a lower price tier, but when they were introduced in 1960, it stood for 5 key features. Automatic winding, a day-dates complication in one window, water resistance, a recessed crown, and a durable case and bracelet. Hey everyone, welcome back to Eric's Everyday Watches. As always, if you like this video, if you find it helpful, please do me a favor, hit the like button and consider subscribing. This watch is currently 53 years old, and I have no idea where it's been for all of its life. I wish I did, because for some reason, I think it's probably a hell of a story. The stuff that movies are made of. Now, chances are I would never know the personal stories that this watch has seen. But what I do know is my story starts here. At an online auction for the Goodwill, where this watch was listed along with 7 other watches, all of which were mistakenly labeled and listed as 8-piece lot fossil men's woman's watch 1.2 pounds. Because apparently when you're buying 8 watches, the overall weight is a key selling point. Who knew? There were only 4 bids placed on this lot, with mine being the winning bid of $23. Now, granted, I had a 50-50 chance that 8 fossil watches might have been shipped to me, and at that point, I think I would have overpaid. But as fate would have it, I got 7 crappy Seiko watches and this 1 diamond in the rough. So thank you, Dr. Fate, aka Pierce Bronson. I know you're looking out for me. Now this is what it looked like when I got it. And sadly, this is after I attempted to polish up the crystal a little bit so you could actually see through it. It kind of worked for like a minute before stopping again. But fortunately, I had seen a blog online about someone who had experience working on these. So after a quick email and some back and forth information exchanged, off this watch went to Duncan, aka the Watch Bloke, over in the UK. That was back in November, and fortunately, I had things to occupy my time. I wasn't just sitting around waiting to get this watch. First off, there was Thanksgiving, and then Christmas, followed by New Year's Eve, and of course New Year's. And with Easter just around the corner, anyways, I had a lot of time to scour the internet and track down an original razor bracelet. Yeah, it turns out you can't get those anymore. At least not without paying an arm and a leg. But I did find what I believe is an age-appropriate, suitable replacement. So a mere 5 months later, and the watch is back in my possession. Now, with all fairness to the watch bloke, I knew how busy he was and what sort of timing to expect. He was very upfront about that. But it's kind of like telling a 5-year-old to just be patient, waiting for Santa Claus. Now, the Christian-style case in this watch is stainless steel, of course. Given its age, I don't know what else it would be. The diameter comes in at just shy of 41 millimeters, with a lug-to-lug distance on the side of 42 millimeters. Now, one of my concerns about tracking down a watch of this year was finding a watch with modern dimensions. No offense to people who like small watches. Personally, my sweet spot is just between 40 to 42 millimeters. That's just what I am comfortable with and what I think looks good on my 7-inch wrist. Now, obviously this watch has seen a lot of wear and tear over its life. I decided my best approach was just to do what I'm referring to as a light buff and polishing, just to clean it up a little bit, but still allow it to show its well-earned passage of time. It doesn't look brand new, but then again, it's not brand new. You can still see all the dings and nicks throughout the case. And I just felt that removing those would not be respecting the age of the watch. I decided to do a light radio brush finish on the case itself and a polished finish on the fixed bezel, just to give it a little bit of its former glory while respecting it for what it is. On back of the watch, we see a screw-down case back with a horseshoe design. A quick and easy way to know that the watch is from the 60s is because it says waterproof instead of water resistance. Personally, I think that's kind of funny. Apparently, sometime in the 60s, they had to admit that nothing is 100% waterproof. Everything has its limits. And instead, they started listing a water resistance. Other marks on the back are the Seiko logo as well as a company crest. The crest indicates the watch production company, and in this case, we see the Danny lightning bolt. Now, the same crest appears on the watch dial. Now, I knew the year of the watch before I bought it because I zoomed in on the online photo and I read the numbers on the back of the case, and I ran it through the website retroseiko.com. So by simply plugging in the numbers, I knew that this watch was manufactured in April of 1969. Inside that case, we have the caliber 5126 automatic movement, and that has 23 joules, beats at 19,800 beats per hour with a day-date complication. Now, the watch bloke over in the UK who serviced this for me said that the biggest difference between this and the Seiko 4 or 6 series is that there is no paw and transmission wheel used to convert the back and forth motion of the rotor into winding the mainspring. This movement actually has more in common with the Swiss movement of using reverser reels to convert the rotor movement. And the rotor design on this is similar to the Lordmatic and King Seikos of the time. Now, most of that is way over my head and is exactly why I sent it to Duncan to service this for me. I know enough to know that I have absolutely no business taking this watch apart. Duncan was the one who supplied all of these inner photos for me, so thank you, Duncan. Now, in my everyday use with this watch, I did find that it is meant to be worn, and I mean every day, because the power reserve on this watch is nothing like a brand new watch today. But of course, once you get to be in your 50s, we all lose a little pep in our step, and I suppose a watch is no different. The crown on this watch is at the 4 o'clock position, has a neat little trick to it. Now, the crown itself is approximately 4 millimeters in width and is nestled into the side of the case. And it is a simple push-pull crown. But here's what makes it different. Turning the crown rotates the internal bezel. How frickin' cool is that, right? Now, the fact that the crown is nestled into the case does make it a little tougher to turn and rotate. But still, you gotta admit, that is pretty frickin' cool. And not to be outdone, setting a date has a little trick to it too. You simply push in the crown and it advances the date 1 number. Again, pretty frickin' cool. And of course, setting a time is the typical pulling the crown out and rotating it. But now you're thinking, okay, what about the day of the week? How do we set that? And that is where the coolness stops, because this is old school. And to set the day of the week, you need to run the hour hand past midnight. So if you're on Sunday and you have to set it to Saturday, that is going to take you a little bit of time. And that is also why you don't see that part in the video today. As I mentioned before, this watch has an internal rotating bezel, but what I did not mention is that is actually made of plastic. A bit surprising, I know, but that's just how they did it back then. I like the way the orange color is used on the bezel as well as the indices and also on the hands, and how the black color helps the orange to pop. Choate from the Seiko Passion Facebook group sent me this catalog cover, and there are 5 watches in this series. It looks like there are 3 different bracelets that were offered. The indice is essentially 2 squares side by side with the inner square being lume. Now, today's watches seem to always have one large indice and the lume is found in the center. This old-time approach seems kind of smart as the lume is more concentrated in one area, and even the off-white color of the lume stands out against the black dial. Now, when I got this watch, the lume on the hands were completely gone, disintegrated, and I asked Duncan to relume the hands for me. I'm not sure he was happy about that because his approach is preservation, not restoration. But I needed the hands loomed, so major thanks to him for doing that. Another nice thing about this dial is notice the way that the width and the shape of the indices match the width and the shape of the hands, giving it a real uniform feel to it. Inside of those indices, we see the Seiko logo and the 5 shield printed directly on the dial. And down below at the 6 o'clock position, we see sports printed in blue, as well as water 70 proof, 23 joules, and again, that lightning bolt crest. The date at the 3 o'clock position is printed white on black, but what I find really interesting here is the shape of the metallic outline. It is not a perfect rectangle, and I've seen this on other vintage watches. I don't know how to describe this shape other than the fact that it's a rectangle with clipped corners that somehow seems to come to a point at both the top and the bottom. So you may be sitting there asking yourself, if this watch is for the Japanese domestic market back in the 60s, why is the day of the week in English? And I didn't know, so I went to my go-to guy, Duncan the Watch Bloke, and I asked him that question. And his response was, he doesn't know. So there you have it. From both sides of the pond, we simply don't know. If anybody knows, please leave a comment down below. Even if you just have a good theory, maybe something about Elvis, the Pepsi Corporation, and aliens, go ahead and leave a comment down below. I'm always up for a good conspiracy theory. So the crystal that came with this watch was of course completely trashed and had to be replaced. Fortunately, the watch bloke had an original crystal for this watch. I debated whether or not I should put in a sapphire crystal, but ultimately, since most of the watch is original, except for the bracelet, I decided to go with the original mineral crystal instead of sapphire, and I think that was the right call here. So originally, this watch would have come with a razor-style bracelet, and unfortunately, that is long gone. For all I know, it could still be in Japan somewhere. And the lug width on this watch is 19 millimeters, which means finding a replacement bracelet was more of a struggle. That is, until I came across the comments online. I read that someone had an odd-sized bracelet and simply took a file and filed it down 1 millimeter, and I thought, that is friggin' brilliant. 1 millimeter is next to nothing. So I bought a 20 millimeter bracelet from AliExpress and used my Dremel tool on it. Is it perfect? No, of course not. But for me, it's good enough until I stumble across something that's even better. And I do think it kind of has that sporty look in that vintage sort of way. So let's go over the specs for this watch. We have a mineral crystal. Granted, 1969 was actually 1 year before Seiko invented their hard lux. It has an automatic movement using a 51/26 caliber. We have a diameter of 41 millimeters, a thickness of 12.5 millimeters, a lug width of 19 millimeters, and a lug-to-lug distance of 42 millimeters. And finally, let's wrap up by going over the pros and cons. For pros, aesthetics. It is a classic, good-looking watch. It's highly legible. I would say it is iconic. The 1960s was the start of the Seiko 5 series. It has unique features, including setting a date and an internal rotating bezel. And for me personally, this happens to be my birth year watch. Now for cons, it is simply old. It's 53 years old. The lume is old. The power reserve is old. The water resistance is old. The way that you set the day of the week, it's all old. So my final thoughts on this watch. Now, this is kind of one-off for the channel. It's the only time I've ever reviewed a watch that wasn't new. But with so many watches today drawing inspiration from past designs, I thought, why not take a look at an actual vintage watch? Now, obviously, I have an immediate connection to this watch, being my birth year. But I hope that maybe this sheds some light on another possibility for you. The idea of not only looking ahead to new watches coming out, but also looking back, sometimes, way back, to vintage watches. For me personally, I think this watch from 1969 is groovy, baby. This has been Eric from Eric's Everyday Watches, reminding you to buy the watch that you love. And don't pay any attention to what anybody else says or thinks. This is your watch collection. If you like this video, if you find it helpful in any way, please do me a favor, hit the like button and consider subscribing. I'll see you in the next video.